Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling a huge question in politics. What happens when power goes completely unchecked? We're going to break down the playbook, see how it was used on a massive scale, and then look at the long shadow it casts on our world today. Okay, so let's start with the basics. At its absolute core, non-democratic rule is all about one thing: the concentration of power. See, in a democracy, power is supposed to be spread out, accountable to the people. But here, it's held in a death grip by a tiny group, maybe a single party, a military elite, or even just one person. And that means no real elections, and huge limits on your freedom to speak your mind or have a say in how things are run. So, that's the million-dollar question, right? If the people don't actually consent to being ruled, how on earth do these regimes hang on to power? It's one thing to grab power. It's another thing entirely to keep it. And to get that, we need to look at the specific tools they use over and over again. So first up, let's pull back the curtain on the universal playbook for staying in charge when you don't have the people's blessing. These are the core mechanics of control. Now, it's really important to get this. Not all non-democratic rule looks the same. On one side, you have totalitarianism. Think of this as the ultimate control fantasy. The regime wants to control everything: what you believe, where you work, who your friends are, all of it, driven by some grand, all-encompassing ideology. But then you have authoritarianism. Now, it's still brutal. It will crush anyone who challenges its political power. But it might not care as much about controlling every little detail of your life. Its main goal is to stay in power, not necessarily to remake society from the ground up. So how do they pull it off? Well, whether a regime is totalitarian or authoritarian, the game plan often comes down to this really powerful three-part toolkit. These are pretty much the pillars holding the whole thing up. Let's break this down. First, you've got coercion. That's the stick, right? It's the secret police, the surveillance, the threat of violence that makes people too afraid to step out of line. Then you have co-optation. This is the carrot. The regime buys loyalty by handing out jobs, money, and special favors to key supporters. And finally, you have the personality cult. This is the story, the propaganda that builds the leader up into this mythical, godlike figure whose rule feels inevitable. Fear, reward, and worship. That is a potent combination. All right, so that's the theory. Now let's see how this whole toolkit was put into practice on an absolutely epic scale by one of the most ambitious political projects in human history: communism. The idea itself, on paper, was revolutionary. The goal was a perfectly equal society. To get there, you had to get rid of private property and the whole idea of class. All the factories, all the farms, everything would be owned by everyone, together. It was a vision of a perfect world with no more exploitation. But, and this is a huge but, to make that utopia a reality, well, that required absolute total control. A single vanguard party took all the power, claiming it was for the good of the people. The entire economy was run by the state. No more free markets. They decided who made what and who got what. And of course, if you're going to totally re-engineer society, you can't have anyone questioning the plan, so all dissent was crushed. And for decades, this system looked absolutely invincible. It shaped global politics for the better part of a century. But underneath the surface, for all its control, the system was rotting from the inside out. And when the end finally came, it happened fast. I mean, the dominoes just fell with stunning speed. The whole system was crippled by a failing economy and the fact that people just didn't believe in the ideology anymore. The fall of the Berlin Wall in '89 was the first major crack. And then just 2 years later, the whole Soviet Union, the very heart of global communism, was gone. Now, this is so important to understand. When communism collapsed, it didn't just create a clean slate. It left behind a really damaging legacy. Decades of one-party rule meant people deeply distrusted any political institutions. There was a very weak sense of the rule of law, and corruption was everywhere. Then, when all the state-owned companies were sold off, a handful of politically connected guys, the oligarchs, got incredibly rich, creating brand new, massive inequalities. I mean, it's just hard to wrap your head around the scale of this. A superpower that had defined the 20th century, built on this massive utopian idea, just vanished. And it left this huge political vacuum in its place. The system itself was gone, but its shadow, oh, that was long. And to really see how that legacy of corruption, distrust, and centralized power continues to shape our world, we've got to look at its former heartland, Russia. You see, what's happening in Russia today didn't just spring out of nowhere in 1991. Its present is a direct result of a long, long history of centralized power, stretching back through the Soviet era and even before that to the czars. Which brings us to what Russia is today. It's not the old Soviet Union, but it's definitely not a democracy. It's what political scientists call a hybrid regime. You've got elections, political parties, a constitution, all the window dressing of democracy. But in reality, the whole system is carefully managed from the top down to make sure the people in power never, ever lose. It's the illusion of choice without the substance. So how does this managed system actually work? Well, the power structure is pretty clear. First, you have overwhelming power concentrated in the presidency, with very few real checks and balances. That power is then amplified by near-total state control over the media, which lets them shape the story. And finally, any opposition that might become a real threat is systematically sidelined, weakened, or just eliminated. And remember that tool of co-optation we talked about, the carrot? Well, this is what it looks like on a national scale. Political power translates directly into economic power. The state controls the most valuable parts of the economy, oil, gas, minerals, and it doles out access to that wealth to those who are loyal. It's a system where your loyalty to the state, not your business smarts, is what makes you rich. Okay, so that brings us right up to today. This highly centralized system, born out of this long history of authoritarianism, is now facing some major, major challenges. Externally, you've got the incredibly costly and isolating war in Ukraine. At home, that pressure has led to an even tighter grip on any kind of dissent. And then you have these long-term ticking clocks. Who eventually takes over from the current leadership? And can the economy withstand the long-term strain of sanctions? It's a system under an immense amount of stress. And all of this leaves us with a really big, fundamental question. It's a question that goes way beyond just Russia, really. For any society trying to break free from a long, powerful legacy of non-democratic rule, how much does the past define the future? And what does it really take to change course? That's something to think about.